SketchUp Animation, despite how like limited it is, can be quite nice. Okay, can be quite nice in the sense that you can create some really interesting animations out of it, and it could look decently pretty. So there's a couple things to kind of do at the very beginning. Obviously, to make sure your file is always running smooth and fast, I always recommend my students to do a couple of things. One is, like if you have materials that you aren't using, you should, click on lists and purge anything unused. For the PC folks, it looks a little bit different. I think I can demonstrate it by using this component. So for the PC folks, there's a button similar to this components panel, like this icon right here, right? There's one somewhere like here for colors or materials, and you can click on it and you can hit purge and use. So the reason why you want to do that is you want to make sure this file is slim and it doesn't have any extra things that you don't need in it. Okay, uh, and I would say you would purge both your components and whatever material you're not using, and that's just standard practice. So the next part would be to kind of like make sure that this model looks okay, right? There's no floating trees, right? There are no extra pieces. And I went through the effort of building a little bit around the building, like you could technically just use the Google Earth like landscape, right? But you wouldn't have any buildings next to it. You wouldn't have any roads, right? So I just went ahead and built a little bit around it so that it doesn't look barren. Okay. But this is completely up to you how you want to treat it. It's always better to have something in the surroundings, so that when you fly around, right, when you're flying around the object or flying around your building, it doesn't look like it's empty. So you can see how like I'm rotating around. It doesn't feel like it's empty, right? Obviously, if you get lower, you start to see the horizon. It is empty. So you have to pick your views very, very carefully. Okay. For some of you guys in my ARC 102 class, you'll reckon or have taken my ARC 102 class would recognize this site. It's pretty obvious, right? Stanyan, Height Street, and then there's what is this? I kind of forgot. It's this drive on in the Golden Gate Park. Kezar Drive, that's right. And there's a little tunnel right here that connects the rest of the, Hippie Hill to the rest of like everything else, right? So for those, so this is it's kind of like a project that's in here, and this model is about like creating this path to connect Height Street to the tunnel and whatnot. So this building kind of exists right here. There's a couple things that you want to do right away, early when you're thinking about the animation. You want to think about styles. Like, how do you want to like portray this, the building? What styles would you want to use? And styles include something a little more complicated, such as like shadows, right? Like, do you want shadows? Because without shadows, it's harder to tell depth, harder to tell like what things is floating and what things aren't. So like I would turn shadows on, although shadows are very intensive to the memory, but I would turn it on just so that I can actually see, like I can actually see when something is floating and when it's not. So it just makes a bit more sense. Oops, sorry, I'm inside the inside the inside the highway now. So shadows is one. Number two is let me see if I can turn on this mouse visualization. Here we go. Number two, I would probably do this. I would go under styles, and I would, there is a current style, which is usually like this. It's almost like this default style in SketchUp, right? Like SketchUp will give you these sort of like, it looks like this. That's the default style in SketchUp. It's gray background, axes, right? You can see this axes. And you want to create something that looks more or less like something interesting. So this is, in some ways, some people like it better like this, other people don't. It's style is up to you. But I noticed that in animation, if you have lines and if you have really, really interesting lines as in your styles, it becomes slower. The animation export is much slower. So, the style that I pick is something like this. Like gradient style is not, oops, sorry, not truly blue, but no lines and shadows, just some play with the style. So how do you get that, right? Like how do you go from this to this, right? Obviously you can pick a style, right? Like there's a bunch of assorted styles here, but they're not really meant for animation. Like all of them are kind of like a little too extreme. So there's like this, right? That that's no good to kind of show your, I don't know. You see how the glass doesn't look transparent anymore, right? So it looks cool, but not great. This is awesome in terms of like making that effect, right? Like making it look like watercolor. But if you have a good computer with dedicated graphics card, this is totally doable, absolutely fine. But if you have like a, I don't know, 13-inch MacBook Pro with no dedicated graphics card. Sorry, Mo. Uh, I also had the same computer, so you would probably want to avoid what they call like these like sort of, I guess like it's like I think they call it watermarks. Like it's an image on top, and also like they play around with these like curves. So then you can actually make it look very different, right? Like this looks highly stylized, but look, notice how the edges they change every time you move, right? Like they change ever so slightly every time you move. So your computer has to re-render each edge every single time you make a move. And there's 30 frames a second, right? For every 1 second of animation, you have to export it 30 times, right? So that's a lot of computational power. It needs to redraw every line. It needs to make sure like the style is kind of like laid on top. So it's pretty heavy on the computer. So that's why I would say don't go with any of this. Start with your default, right? This is your default like SketchUp style. Go to edit and then like start looking at what's being done, right? Under edit there's like lines, like faces, the background versus skies, watermarks, and also like the model like tools, right? So these five like settings are going to determine how your model looks. So number one, I would start at the very end. I'd probably start at the very end and work my way back up to the front, front. So at the very end, there's all these, right? There's selected lock. I don't need to change any of this stuff up here, but I do want to kind of uncheck this because I don't want my axes to ever show up, right? Axes is really meant for you to kind of like model and like understand like which direction is what. So I want to like turn off model axes right away. Okay. If you have guides that you use to kind of guide you to how you modeled, right? Like you set these like dotted lines. Now you might want to turn it off too. And if you have any foreground photos or not, but I don't think you do. Like most people aren't using the feature of using a foreground photo. This is how you model something when you're looking at a photo. Um, there's a way to do that. Like if all you have is a photo, you can still use it to kind of like help you model something. I don't think anybody has really done that in this class. So I'm turning off model axis guides. I'll work my way back up, watermarks. If you're using a super free version of SketchUp, there's definitely a watermark here, and I would delete it. Okay, like I think if you're using the online version and you download the model to use it on your computer, right, you'll get a watermark, and I would get rid of it for the animation. Then there's this sky and ground. So here, right now, the background is gray. So there's no sky, there's no ground, right? You can see how if I look up and I look down, it's the same gray. That's because there's a 360, well, I was gonna say dome, 360-degree dome, but really it's just a color for the background. So if I click on this and I decided that I'm gonna use white, and by the way, I kind of made these colors. You can click, you can you can click on something and then pick a color. But for me, I made this white and I dragged it in earlier at some point. Um, so, or you can just go to colors, right? Like there's all these colors here, and you can also drag it in like this. I think it's different on the PC side. Like there's a little bit of difference in how you pick these colors, but you can always just go to, colors and just choose white, right? Or you can choose some other colors, but it doesn't look that good. For now, just choose white, okay? And if you go back to your styles, now you can check sky and ground. So sky and ground is just like, this is where the horizon is, right? Above that horizon is, above that horizon is blue. And I can change that blue to something else. I can change it to that. I can change it to this. You have a choice, right? You have a choice in your animation, like what color sky you want. Okay, this was like 2 months ago when we were completely, you know, blacked out, right? Or this, right? You can do something like that if you like. That would be very interesting as part of the animation, but you totally can, right? Like there's styles that you can set. I'm going to not do that for this. Oh, actually, you know what? I'll leave it at this color. It's probably fine. But since I'm not gonna like render it live in front of you, I'm the final animation may not look the same. Okay, so there's the colors for the sky, and we'll work our way forward to the face. Um, I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't change any of the settings here. The only thing that you would really need to do is make sure that you're in this mode. This one right here shows texture. If you go to this one, this just shows the color. If you go to this one, it's just all white, right? This one, it's just wire. They call this a wireframe. So this is all just, wires. So yeah, you have different styles that you can kind of pick, right? But I wouldn't just turn off X-ray and just use this one, texture. Okay, makes perfect sense. Material transparency, just leave it checked. Otherwise, your glass will just look solid. Okay. All right. So, and I probably, if you have a fast computer, you can go with nicer. Slower computer, you can go with faster. And I'm gonna go with faster just because of time for now. Okay. So, and the final one is edges. So we talked about this. You can kind of stylize your SketchUp images. You notice how the profile is a little thicker, right, than the inner lines. And I can always change this to like something bigger, right? So you can see how, like by changing it to 5, now the profile is a lot thicker and you can kind of see depth, right? So there's that. Or you can turn it off and there's no profiles at all. It's, if you were in my Rhino class, you'll see like I put a lot of emphasis on like making sure that people understand that having this like profile around the building kind of helps you see, like help you see the building and let it pop out of the background, right? But when you're animating, actually there's a need to like kind of decrease the number of edges so that your computer doesn't have to render the edges. So I'm turning them off, but if you have a fast computer, you can definitely like, I wouldn't do back edges. It's a little distracting, too many lines. I would consider, what are these other, lines that I can use. Extensions is very popular among older architects who used to draw, because when you draw, when you draw straight lines, a lot of people extend their lines beyond the point of where they end to keep them straight. So in the old days, this is a very popular style. And then of course, extension points, end points, if they're like thicker, so then it looks like there's an emphasis or where your pen kind of ends right there. So there's stuff like this, right? People do this all the time. There's also jitter. Jitter is really, really hard to see, but you can see how like some lines have double lines. Oops. It's trying to zoom in here. Very hard to see, but some lines have double lines, some lines have single lines. It's trying to mimic the way that human beings draw. But the problem with using jitter is that, like every time you move, you notice how like the lines are changing, right? They're slightly changing. Just take a look at this corner right here. They're slightly changing, like there's double lines, sometimes single lines. So that's a lot of, once again, computational power. So I'm just gonna like kind of turn off all my lines just so that it runs fast and smooth. The computer does not need to draw the lines at all. And so that makes it really, really quick. So now I have the style, right? And it's important to save the style. And the best way to kind of save the style is to, let's go back to kind of close out of the styles thing, is to go back to select and see how this, uh, if I click on this again, I'm going to lose everything that I just did. And it's because this style hasn't been saved yet. This is a temporary preview of the style. And to really save the style, you actually need to click this button right here. Update style with changes. If you do not click this refresh button after you're done, this is a temporary viewing of a style. Okay, so you must save the style by hitting this. So you'll see how it now looks kind of like it, right? I don't know what this icon means right here, but I think it just means that you picked a style and you edited the style yourself. So it's got this little like clock icon in here. So I've got the style, looks decent, looks kind of nice, right? So to kind of set up my animation now, there's one other step you must do before you start like playing around with your, before you start making animation. One of them, actually, you know what? One of them, you know what? I'm gonna show this later. I'll show this after I actually pick what my views are. So I'm gonna do this. Go under. So there's windows and scenes, and scenes kind of show you what all the different like all the different scenes that you have made in your model. And you'll recognize that, hey, some of them are got these brackets around them and some of them don't, right? And you're like, why is that? Well, the ones with the brackets are actually something that isn't going to show up in your animation. They're more like there so that you can have a view, but not meant to show up in the animation. So the way Sketchup Animation works is that it'll try to link one view where one camera position is. So like say here, actually, hold on, so every view actually has a style. So I'm gonna make a brand new view with a style first. So hold on, select the style, and then I'm gonna make a brand new view, add C9, right? So you'll see how at the bottom, there is a scene 9. And if you click on this down button, this show details button, this is where all the settings for that scene is located. So you can see how it says include an animation checked. If I uncheck it, you'll see the brackets, right? So if you export this animation right now, you can see how F1, no style, and restyle are the ones without the brackets. So they're going to be the ones that are going to be exported. So if I export this animation right now, it will go from F1 to no style to restyle. I don't want that. I'm going to go to F1 right now and uncheck that. I'm going to no style and I'm going to uncheck that and restyle and uncheck that. And I'm just going to start at scene 9 and I'm going to include it. And you'll see how scene 9 is now the only one without a bracket. So I'm going to move this to the very, very end by hitting this down button right here. So, and I'm going to call that number 1. So in my movement, or maybe you can do, let's see, path 1A, right? That's a better name. So you guys have these like sort of names for paths, right? So path 1A might start here and then might zoom in and then go to something like this. And then I can add another scene by hitting this plus button right here. And then you'll see how it says scene 10. I'm gonna do path 1B. Very important thing. You want to make sure that your style is on. You want to make sure that your shadow is on before you start making scenes, because you'll notice how every scene inherits like the styles and all the things that you've, all the shadows, right? So if you didn't do it and then later on you figure out you had to do it, you have to go back, right? So let's just say here you didn't have the right styles, right? Let's just say, for example, you had this style instead, right? Uh, you would have to go, and you didn't have shadows. Let's just say you didn't have shadows as all, right? You would have to do something like what I'm doing right now. So from A, by the way, and then to B, sorry, it cuts through the building. I'm gonna fix that. You'll see how it changed styles, right? And it turned off the shadows. So you have to go back and you have to select the right style. You have to turn on shadows and then you have to hit update. And when you do it after you've set up like 15 of these, that's going to be a pain, right? You got to turn them all on and hit update for every single one. A lot of work. Man, you guys need coffee. So I would make sure that as you turn on your styles, turn on your shadows early at the very beginning before you start setting your views. So I'm going to update that second view to look something like this, path 1B, like this. And then I'm going to swing around like this and then add another one. So once again, go under scenes, you can hit add, or you can right click on these guys and add another one. And then you'll see how it'll add another one right next to it. I'm just going to finish up by moving up and then finish up right up here. Now it's going to go from here to here to here, here to here. I'm punching through the building. So there are definitely some limitations to how you can move in SketchUp, because it's just from one position, straight line to the other one, and then straight line to the other one. So maybe for this one, I'm gonna move down a little bit, like maybe to here. Update. And if you feel like this is not wide angle enough for you, you can go to camera, field of view, and you'll notice how here it says 40 degrees, right? So maybe I'll change it. Maybe I'll type 670 degrees. And that's wider, right? Hit update. You'll see how it goes from 40 degrees when I'm outside to when I'm inside, 70 degrees, right? And then I'll add another frame over here so that I can, so I don't run into the door and then eventually go out like this. And then I'll update this last one. So it would look something like this. Actually, let me rename these real quick. So path. I'm just gonna call them 1C. 1C, 1D, 1E. I'm not even gonna like have path in there because you'll see why. As you rename them, they become longer and longer and longer, right? So if you type path in there, it takes up more room. So this bar gets infinitely long and then you're just gonna run out of space. So here we go A, right? B, C, D, E, F. Okay, so pretty much done, right? That path is pretty good. I think I have no problems with it. So that's a very simple path. So there's one other step you need to do before you actually export it. And this is a step that like a lot of students don't discover till like, well, I think Michelle teaches it, but like I don't know if she actually does. Under Window, there's something called Model Info. I think it's the same place for PC and Macs. And under this model info, there's a bunch of really interesting stuff in here. I think you guys should like play around with this a little bit, like, you know, in the future, because like there's some things like, you know, units, right? Like what type of units are you using, right? If you accidentally set it to engineering, you can set it back to architecture. There's, you know, like what are the default text sizes, statistics about your model. You can always purge and use over here, you know, kind of clean up the model a little bit more. Um, I've already purged everything, so I don't need to. Uh, there's all this stuff like anti-aliasing, and I do turn it on. Anti-aliasing is definitely like useful. Um, and we'll talk a little bit about anti-aliasing in the very end. Okay. Geolocate, file, blah blah blah. Right. The one that's most important is animation. Okay. So if you do not enable scene transition, right, what happens is you don't fly from one to the next. You just skip and it'll pause. Okay. So you must have this on if you want to fly from one to the next. So if you're primarily modeling, right, like you're only trying to look at like different views really quickly for rendering purposes and not for animation purposes, you would definitely uncheck this, right? You don't need this at all. So if you're working in an office, all you do is rendering, you don't do SketchUp animations, you would uncheck this, right? But if you're doing an animation, you want to have this on, right? And let's just say you wanted to, like, right now it's 1.5 seconds between each. So it takes 1.5 seconds to go from 1A to 1B. Might be a little quick. So you can kind of drop that. You can go back to window, model. Let's just say 3 seconds, right? And then 3 seconds, you can see how it takes a little bit longer to kind of go from 1A to 1B to 1C. So each one of these would be 3 seconds, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this would be an 18-second animation right here. Okay. But there is one thing that's problematic. So I'll just turn this on right now. And this is something that, let's see, let's go right here. Hold on. Let's see. There is a toolbar for animation. Let me see if I can find it. I don't normally. Oh, you know what? I think I can just go to view animation and just hit play. And you'll, you'll see how it goes. It'll just play from 1A, and you'll see how it kind of stops, and then like pauses, and then plays, pauses, plays, and pauses. And that's not great because like you really want your animation to be pretty smooth, right? You want it to like kind of be continuous. So what you can do is under the same thing, under tools, model information, which I just discovered that if you go under view, animation, and settings, it takes you to the same place. Okay. You can get rid of this scene delay. The scene delay is that 1 second between each scene to move on. So if you make it 0 seconds, right? And then close out of this, view, animation, and then play, you'll see how it'll just play the animation with no breaks in between. And that makes it a way smoother like animation in many ways. Okay? Does that make sense to you guys? Like these really simple tools is going to make it a little bit smoother, but there's really limited control, animation control in SketchUp. This is all you can really do. It's about all you can really do. And I think it's, now I got to stop the animation. View animation. Stop. Hold on. There we go. All right. So there's very limited things that you can do in this, and it's fine. It's totally fine. I do want to point out one thing before we export it. And I'm going to open it up to questions. Uh, you want to make sure that you have all these things like checked, right? uh, like shadow settings, fog settings, active planes, visible. You want to make sure you have all those checked for every single scene, because if you don't have camera location like checked, when you are here, right, and you make the next scene, it's not going to move the camera at all if you don't have this check. And that doesn't matter like what like preview or wherever you set it. If you don't have the camera location checked, it's not gonna it's not gonna fly between one scene to the next. So you want to make sure that these are all checked at the very beginning. Okay. So I'm gonna hit export now because I know I only have 1A to 1F included in animation. All the other all the other scenes have these little brackets in them, right? If you're doing multiple like passes, what you can do is, let's just set up a couple more, right? Let's just set a second pass like this. I'm gonna go from here down, right? So I'll just add one right here. So fly to about here, um, and then here I'm gonna like just what's it? Camera field of view. I'm gonna set it to like 70. Oops, oops, did not set it to 70. Oh, okay, now I'm in the building. So something like this, add, and then here, right? So let's just say I have a second series of, and I don't want to, I don't really want to animate them now. So I'm gonna say 2A, right? 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D. All right, so I don't want to animate the second set, right? So what I can do is I can select one, hit shift, pick the bottom one, select all of them, and uncheck include animation. So when I want to animate only the first path, right, like my my one series, I'm fine. It's just gonna export the one series. When I'm done with the one series, I can select all of them, uncheck include animation, select all the two series, and check animation. You'll see how they all show up without brackets. So now I can export the two series instead of the A series. Okay. So you want to make sure that you have the right like set of animation, like scenes, right? The one A's, the one F, and you want to make sure they're included in animation and you're ready to export. So I'm just going to move back to this beginning scene 1A, and I'm going to export. File, export, animation. This is where I talk about a couple of things, okay? Compress with H.264 MPEG-4. Okay, you guys all know what MP4 is because you already made one. Uh, this is the one you should use. If you ever want to do slide animation, like frame by frame by frame, you can always do JPEG, but you'll get like hundreds of JPEG, right? So if you have an 18-second, animation times 30 frames a second, 18 times 30, so something like 600, around a little under 600 frames, maybe like 540 frames or something like that, okay? 540 frames of JPEGs, something you don't want to keep on your desktop, okay? So if you select compress with H.264, that's just one video file, okay? So I almost never recommend doing this. It's just like there are certain situations where you would use JPEG, but almost always you use the video file, okay? Options, and here's where all the juicy stuff is. This is the stuff that I kind of try to explain using our Canvas page, but I'll try to do it here as best I can. Resolution, right? Are we doing 720p or 1080? This is coming up. Every time you do a video, this is coming up. This number, either it's 720p or 1080, is always going to come up. So remember, this is the height of your screen, okay? If your video, like if your computer is pretty decent, right, 1080p, no problem. 720p is for for computers that are a little bit older. I think I can get away with like 1080p, so but for the sake of time, I might do 720p. Okay. And here, the linear scale, I'm not changing it. If you change the scale, right, you can see how uh, it'll actually, you won't actually see it, but it doubles this. It doubles this width. So I'm not changing it. Um, let's see. Last thing, frames rate. I can't really show you the difference in frame rate, but if you did a test using your Google Earth, 24 is choppier than 30. Okay. And let's see, I do have some examples here. Let's see, frame rate. So this one is a pretty good example. 10 frames per second. You can see how choppy it is over here. Obviously on Zoom, it's a little hard because the frame rate is pretty low anyways. Let me see if I can optimize it for video. Here, do you guys see it? It's really choppy, right? It's jumping around.
Yes.
But on the bottom, it's a little smoother at 30 frames a second, right? You can see that car like kind of chopping in and out. So I want to make sure you guys understand that. Like, so this is where frame rate matters, okay? And I would make sure you would set like a slightly, higher frame rate. So 24 or 30 is probably fine. Okay, 30 is smoother than 24. Takes longer, you know, roughly about 25% longer, right? 6 frames out of 24 is 25%, right? So I'm just gonna set it to 30. And then it says loop to starting scene. Do I want to go from the very end, which is my 1F, and go back to 1A? Probably not. It's gonna add another like 3 seconds to my animation. So I'm gonna uncheck this. I don't want to go from the final frame 1F to fly back to the original 1A. Not an advisable thing if you're doing a straight path, right? And the very last option, anti-alias rendering. Okay, this is hard to explain, but in computer technology, uh, anti-aliasing is actually blurring of the edges to make something appear sharper to our brains. It's a very counterintuitive thing. So like if you look at pixels, they're really jagged, right? Like your mind kind of sees it right away and like, oh, that looks very like looks really like unreal because like in nature, like everything is kind of blurred into one and you don't really see edges, right? So in computer technology, what they've done is they've been blurring a lot of the pixels to kind of fill in these jagged areas. And by doing that, actually, if you squint your eyes when you look at this, squint your eyes and look at these lines, and you'll realize that you'll see the jaggedness in the left side, but you won't see the jaggedness on the right side. You'll actually see kind of a smooth line, right? So squint your eyes and then look at it, or like focus on something really close to you, and then you'll see how like the line on the right actually looks nicer than the line on the left. Okay, so that's something really interesting in computer animation that I always keep it on, but it requires more computational power because your computer has to like fill in all these like gray areas, right? Like that's not there, right? It's filling it in. So, okay. And then where do I want to put it? I want to put it on my teaching folder. So project 4, and we call it in class demo red skies. Export. And then it'll give you a time and so on, right? So my computer is decently fast, so it's not really an issue for me. So it takes about a minute or two to kind of do this. I had to buy a new like computer over the summer because like I just couldn't. The last semester I tried to do the same demo. It was just like excruciatingly painful. But to kind of show you like a version of this that I did, It's not the same animation, but this is what it looks like when you're done like animating. So even though it's SketchUp, right, not Twinmotion, it can still be nice. There's a pause in here because I wanted to show a rendering right at this moment, and then it kind of moves away back. I'll show you guys how to do a pause in a second. Um, you can actually make a pause in your animation. So this part, pretty simple, I think. Uh, let's see, it's almost done. It's almost done. So let's see. It looks like, where's our red skies? Huh. Did I not? That's funny. Where did it go? Huh. I thought I put it in here. That's funny. Give me 1 second. I gotta look for it. Export animation. Oh, it is in here. Sorry. I just couldn't see it. It's this one right here. It looks like this. I think it's decent as an animation. I mean, yeah, the graphics look like they came out of the 1990s, but it's still like, I think it's still a pretty viable form of animation, right? So there's that. If you want to put a pause in there, right? If you want to put a pause, say between, let's just say you want to say pause right here before moving on to like from 1B to 1C, you want to put a pause in there, right? All you got to do is just take the same frame, right, at 1B, and then you add another frame. And then that frame, you can name it pause. And the reason why this works well, the reason why this works, adding another frame from the same location, is that it's trying to move between 1B to the pause camera location. And because the camera location is exactly the same location, it just takes the 3 seconds that it would normally take to go from 1A to 1B and from 1B to pause. It just takes that 3 seconds and just stay still for 3 seconds. So in your animation, it would look something like this. View, animate, right, play. So, and it would just pause for 3 seconds and then it'll just keep on going. Now, why would you need a pause button? It's if you want to transition from like an animation to, well, a render, right, in between, and you want to have a little bit of space to kind of let the video kind of breathe a little bit, right? So it doesn't just fly and then you just stop. And I'll in next week when I show you how to use Premiere, you'll see why that matters. So if you plan to use a rendering somewhere in your animation, give it a pause, give it a couple second pause, right? And just remember, the pause is really not pausing. It's just, moving from the camera position of 1B to the position of pause, which is the same location. So it's just staying there in the same location, right? Because there's nowhere to go. Okay. So just to kind of re-emphasize before we go on break and come back, I'll show you how to do this in Twinmotion. Like almost everything that you learned today has to do with three things. One of them is, shadows and styles, right? So you need to turn on your shadows, set up your styles pretty early on. Number two, set up your scenes, right? Like what's your path? You set up a series of different scenes and SketchUp will move between one scene to the next scene to the next scene, right? So you got to set up a series of scenes and you have to either include them or not include them in your animation, right? If you don't include them in your animation, if you uncheck it, right, you'll start to see brackets around that scene. If you include it, the brackets will be removed. So that's pretty easy to kind of spot what's in the current animation or not, right? And then lastly, you should go to Window, Model Info, and you can get there the same way through View, Animation, and Settings, right? And you have these two options. You want to enable scene transitions. You want to set it to a time probably a little slower than 1 second, because then you just kind of fly through the space, right? If you feel like your animation is just like too quick, set this transition time to be a little longer. And then you probably do not want to have delays, otherwise you're just kind of like stopping, right? You want to make sure you don't have any delays. And if you do actually want to stop, you can just create an extra frame, of the place that you want to stop, and it will stop for exactly the same amount of scene transition from one scene to the next, right? So you don't need to actually create a scene delay. You just need to like create an extra scene from the same location. So I never actually use scene delay at all. Okay. So that's it in terms of SketchUp animations. I'm open to any questions. I know I covered a lot, but nobody like stopped me in between. So
For the site, do we have to draw it, or can we import it from somewhere surroundings?
uh, hey, who's asking the question right now?
It's Daniel Leon.
I drew this, right? Like it's not really complicated, but you can easily just use, the Google Earth image, right? And then pop a couple buildings in there, right? Like, look, you can definitely try to like import stuff, but to be honest with you, like you don't need everything. I did this in maybe 5 minutes of work. Okay, I just looked at the image and I'm like, okay, there's a couple of buildings. I looked at Google Earth and I'm giving it a rough estimate of how tall things are. Okay, like I don't think you guys need to like be too serious about the sort of surrounding. You just need something, right?
Okay.
Because when you're animating, your focus is on your building, not really the surroundings. Okay.
Okay.
Um, so like, and if some people are really, really like have really good computers, they can even turn on like this feature, which I can't. It's just it's too heavy for my computer. You don't want to do too much with the background. You add a couple buildings. You just turn on fog, right? And then you can't really see the background anymore, like beyond a certain distance, right? Like you can actually set it to be like this, and you can't really see the background at all, and it will show up in your animation. It's super, super wild, and I wouldn't. It's really intensive on your computer. And your export would be very slow, but you can turn on fog to hide, your surroundings. You can even like, let's see, you could even do this. Whoa. Since we're talking about the apocalypse, right? So you could do that, right? But I would say, just leave it as the background color. Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Only if you have a strong computer, and you would need to determine this really early on. Do a couple scenes, turn it on, right? Make sure do a couple scenes with fog on, and then see how long the export takes. If it takes you a long time, don't do it. You can see how every frame has slightly different fog, so it's re-rendering the fog, the draw distance. But it's so cool, I gotta say. Like, just think about the stylized animation right here. Like, you're just flying through this, and then you can see like the stylized leaves, and then you're building with fog, right? That's super cool. Okay, other questions before we go on break? Okay, let's go on break, and when we come back, I'll show you how to do animations in Twinmotion. And I guarantee you it's a little less complicated, even though it takes more computational power. Okay, little less. It's not as complicated. There isn't as much of these like different things to click, right? There's only like 2 places to click instead of 3. Okay. All right. So let's come